He battled dyslexia, Crohn's disease, and critics who said he'd never make it. Yet George the Animal Steele became a wrestling legend. This is his story of resilience. Let's get into it. Before he was ever the Animal, George Steele was just a regular guy named Jim Myers, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Believe it or not, this wildman wrestler was actually a star athlete in high school. He played football and even earned himself a scholarship to Michigan State University. But life had other plans. A knee injury sidelined his football dreams, so Jim turned his attention to academics and earned a master's degree. Jim Myers taught and coached at a high school in Michigan, and by all accounts, he was a darn good one. But something was missing. He had this itch for something more, something exciting. And that's when he stumbled into the world of professional wrestling. He started wrestling part-time while still teaching, and boy, did he make an impression. With his wild hair, crazy eyes, and the habit of biting the turnbuckles, he quickly became a fan favorite. He adopted the name George the Animal Steele, and a legend was born. He was a genius, but George's style wasn't for everyone. He was known for being a bit, shall we say, unpredictable. One minute he'd be in the middle of a match, and suddenly he'd start biting the turnbuckles, or he'd headbutt his opponent out of nowhere. He even had this habit of tearing apart the stuffing from turnbuckles and shoving it in his opponent's mouths. Can you imagine? Now, the controversies really started when some wrestlers, like the technical master Bret the Hitman Hart, weren't too thrilled about this. They felt George was too rough, too wild, and could seriously injure someone with his antics. They say it's like trying to have a nice, civilized chess game with someone who keeps flipping the board over. It's hilarious, to be honest. And it wasn't just his wildness. Many of his peers also thought George wasn't the most skilled wrestler. Sure, he had his signature moves, like the flying hammerlock and the airplane spin, but his arsenal was pretty limited. Some critics felt he was more about the crazy character than actual wrestling prowess. These controversies are barely ever discussed because this man was loved by all, and the fans wouldn't let anyone say anything against their favorite. They were crazy for George. But why? Well, it's because they knew the troubles he battled throughout his life. Let's start with one of the early hurdles George faced, dyslexia. Dyslexia is a learning disorder that makes reading and writing more difficult. For many, it can be a frustrating and isolating experience, but Jim didn't let it define him. He found ways to navigate the challenges, building a life and career that many would admire. But dyslexia wasn't the only obstacle he faced. In 1988, he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, a serious inflammatory bowel disease. If you don't know much about Crohn's, it's a chronic condition with symptoms that can be incredibly painful and disruptive. Unfortunately, there's no cure for it, though with treatment, the disease can go into remission. For Jim, his faith and determination became key parts of his battle with this illness. A decade after his diagnosis, in 1998, George received news that must have felt like a miracle. His doctors told him that his Crohn's disease had gone into remission. The symptoms that had affected his daily life were gone, and he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But George wasn't one to leave things to chance. In 2002, he made the courageous decision to have his colon removed to ensure that the disease would not return and disrupt his life again. Throughout these trials, Jim's faith was his anchor. He was a devout Christian, and his relationship with God guided him through the ups and downs of life. He was an active member of the First Baptist Church in Merritt Island, Florida, where he was known for his dedication to the community and his unwavering belief in God's plan. For Jim, faith wasn't just something he practiced. It was a source of strength that carried him through some of his darkest days. He also found strength and love in his family. He shared a beautiful life with his wife, Pat, whom he married before starting his studies at Michigan State University in 1956. Their bond was strong, and together they created a life rooted in love and faith. The couple raised 3 children, their daughter Felicia and 2 sons, Dennis and Randy. The Myers family made their home in Cocoa Beach, Florida, where Jim and Pat built a warm and loving environment for their family. Life wasn't just about the challenges for Jim. It was also about the joys. He found happiness in the simple moments spent with his family and the fulfillment of living a life of faith. Even with the difficulties he faced, Jim never wavered in his commitment to his loved ones and his belief in God. As the years went on, Jim's health became more fragile. On February 16, 2017, he passed away in hospice care due to kidney failure. He was 79 years old. While his passing was a loss for those who knew and loved him, Jim left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. To honor his legacy, let us relive his career today. But before we get into it, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks. Born on April 16, 1937, in Detroit, Michigan, William Myers grew up in Madison Heights. In the early 1960s, Myers stepped into Detroit's wrestling scene under the masked persona of the student. Wrestling allowed him to protect his identity while exploring this new venture. As the student, he relied on raw strength rather than fancy moves, making him stand out in a world of highly technical wrestlers. It wasn't long before he caught the eye of wrestling legend Bruno Sammartino, who saw great potential in the newcomer. With Sammartino's guidance, Myers transitioned to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, what we now know as WWE, and created the character that would change his life forever. The transformation from William Myers to George the Animal Steele was nothing short of iconic. Myers dropped the mask, embraced the wildman persona, and leaned into his natural charisma. But where did the name come from? According to Myers, he was inspired by a high school coaching rival named George Steele. He asked if he could use the name, and the rest is history. As for the animal part, that evolved naturally as he developed his gimmick. George Steele became a unique force in wrestling. With his hunched posture, fur-covered back, and hairless head, he looked more like a Neanderthal than a man. Fans were mesmerized by his wild antics in the ring. Tearing apart turnbuckles with his teeth and using the stuffing as a weapon became his signature move. And then there was the green tongue, achieved by chomping on Cloray's breath mints, that only added to the bizarre spectacle. Despite his wild appearance, Steele was actually a thoughtful and well-spoken man. In fact, his infamous da-da interview style was born out of Vince McMahon's vision. Steele had been cutting articulate promos, but McMahon stopped him mid-speech and said, "You're making too much sense for an animal." Frustrated, Steele mumbled nonsense on his next take, expecting McMahon to change his mind. Instead, McMahon loved it, and the garbled animal promos became a staple of his character. Steele's rise to fame in the wrestling world was unstoppable. By the 1980s, he was one of the most recognizable figures in the sport. One of his most memorable storylines was his feud with Macho Man Randy Savage, centered around Steele's infatuation with Savage's valet, Miss Elizabeth. Fans loved the dynamic of the wild and innocent Steele, crushing on Elizabeth, creating a mix of humor and drama. The rivalry was so popular that it extended well beyond its original plan, lasting into 1987. The storyline even played into WrestleMania 3, one of the biggest wrestling events of all time. During Randy Savage's match against Ricky Steamboat for the Intercontinental Championship, Steele, who was in Steamboat's corner, interfered twice. He snatched the ring bell away from Savage and later shoved him off the top rope, helping Steamboat secure the win. It was a pivotal moment in a match that's still considered one of the greatest in wrestling history. Then in 1988, George was supposed to be part of a WrestleMania 4. It was a big deal with all the top wrestlers competing. There was a special match called a Battle Royal where many wrestlers piled into the ring and fought until only one was left standing. George was all set to be in it, but unfortunately, he hurt his knee at another wrestling show just before WrestleMania. So instead of getting in the ring and brawling with the other guys, he had to sit this one out. He was there at ringside, but he couldn't participate. It must have been tough for him to watch from the sidelines. Sadly, things took another turn for George when he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. It's a serious illness that affects your digestive system, and it made it really hard for him to keep wrestling. So with a heavy heart, George decided to retire from the ring. But even though he couldn't wrestle anymore, George still had a lot to offer the wrestling world. He loved the business and wanted to stay involved, so he started working behind the scenes for the WWF. He became a road agent, which basically means he helped plan matches, develop storylines, and make sure everything ran smoothly. He was like the mastermind behind the scenes, using his years of experience to help the next generation of wrestlers. Unfortunately, like many businesses, the WWF went through some tough times and had to make some budget cuts. Sadly, George was one of the people who lost their job. But don't worry, he wasn't gone for long. The WWF quickly realized what a valuable asset he was, and they rehired him pretty quickly. He continued to work as a road agent for many years, helping to shape the WWF into the global phenomenon it is today. Now, even though George never won any championships in the WWF, He was still one of the most beloved and recognized figures in wrestling history. Fans loved his wild personality, his crazy antics, and his unique style. He was a true original, and his impact on the wrestling world was undeniable. So much so that in 1995, he was inducted into the WWF Hall of Fame. It's a huge honor, and it cemented his place as one of the all-time greats. But even though he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, George wasn't quite done with wrestling. In the late 90s, he started wrestling again in smaller, independent wrestling shows. He even popped up on WWF television a few times, teaming up with other wrestlers and entertaining the fans with his signature craziness. One of the most memorable moments of his later career was when he joined a group called The Oddities. It was a collection of wrestlers who were all a bit unusual, a bit different, and a bit, well, odd. George fit right in with this quirky group, and they became quite popular with the fans. George also dabbled in the world of acting. He even landed a role in a movie called Ed Wood, directed by Tim Burton. He played a wrestler-turned-actor named Tor Johnson. It's kind of funny because earlier in his career, people often mistook George for Tor Johnson. He even said that a store in New York once sold a Tor Johnson mask as a George Steele mask to try and make more money. But acting wasn't George's only venture outside of wrestling. He also appeared in a commercial for Minolta cameras with the famous actor Tony Randall. And if that wasn't enough, he even starred in a short film with another wrestler named Greg Valentine. They played two guys who buy a fishing camp together. It was meant to be the start of a comedy series, but unfortunately, it never got picked up. George continued to wrestle here and there for a few more years, always bringing his unique brand of entertainment to the ring. He even made a surprise appearance at a big wrestling event for another company called TNA Wrestling. He was part of a mock wedding ceremony for two of the wrestlers, and it was a hilarious moment that fans still talk about today. And just when you thought he was done, George surprised everyone by showing up on WWE television again in 2010. It was during a match between two other wrestlers, and the crowd went wild when they saw him. It was a reminder of just how much he meant to the wrestling world and how much his fans loved him. All in all, George the Animal Steele was far more than just a wild character in the wrestling ring. Behind the turnbuckle-biting antics and green tongue was Jim Myers, a kind-hearted man, a devoted family man, and an inspiration to many. From his humble beginnings in Detroit to his days as a teacher and coach, Jim's life was shaped by hard work, determination, and a drive to overcome obstacles. His journey into professional wrestling wasn't just about fame, it was a way to bring joy to millions of fans. Despite criticisms from some peers, George Steele carved out his place in the wrestling world by embracing his unique style and connecting with audiences in a way few could. Whether it was his feuds with Randy Savage or his comedic antics with the Oddities, George brought a sense of wonder and unpredictability to the sport. Off the mat, Jim faced personal battles with incredible courage. Dyslexia and Crohn's disease could have defined his life, but he chose faith, love, and perseverance to overcome these challenges. His strong relationship with his wife, Pat, and his deep connection to his family and faith were the true pillars of his life. Even after retiring from the ring, George remained a cherished figure, giving back to the wrestling community as a road agent and inspiring countless fans with his resilience. His later ventures, from acting in Ed Wood on to occasional returns to wrestling, proved that George Steele was a man who embraced every chapter of life with passion and humor. As we celebrate his legacy, let's remember that George Steele wasn't just the animal, he was a symbol of persistence, love, and the joy of living authentically. If you enjoyed this dive into the life of George Steele, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about the icons of wrestling history. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your favorite memory of the animal.